Welcome everyone to the Book of the Covenant with Rabbi David Silber. This is our final session for now, although this general series going through the first two books of Tanakh will pick up again in Elul. Thank you everyone for joining. Sources for today's class will come from Shemot and Shmuel Bet. If you have a preferred Tanakh, you're welcome to use it as a reference. I will also be sharing sources on screen from Sefaria. And with that, I want to turn things over to Rabbi Silber for one last time in this session.
Thank you very much. Okay, again, as Kayla said, this is the last of the 3 additional sessions that we added on just to sense that we should at least touch upon some of the laws that are found in Mishpatim, also called the Book of the Covenant, in chapter 24. Maybe we'll get there next time we have a set of sessions, complete Sefer Shemot, and move on to other things. But I want to go back to chapter 23. Chapter 23 has a bunch of laws, and I just wanted to touch upon how the tradition sees them, and then to look at a story which I think has these psukim in mind. As I mentioned last week, these rules, sometimes it's difficult to know who's being addressed over here. Is the individual person being addressed? Or some of these rules address specifically to judges. And as I mentioned last week, it takes us back really to chapter 18 of Sefer Shemot that we studied, where Yitro sees Moshe sitting by himself, and he says to him, "What's going on here? Why are you sitting by yourself? And all these people are standing in front of you." And Moshe said, "Well, they come for justice, they come for judgment, they come to understand the laws, and I bring the matter to God." And Yitro said to him, "That's a bad thing. It doesn't work. You wither away, they'll wither away. You can't get justice. We have to wait years to get a case." So therefore, he advises Moshe to choose people based on certain criteria. There, the criteria largely are issues of matters of integrity and honesty, and they will assist you. They will deal with most of the cases. When there's a matter that's too difficult or too big, Yitro says, Moshe said too difficult, they have to come to you and you bring the matter to God, because only you have access. So Moshe agrees, and he listens to his father-in-law, and he does everything his father-in-law told him to do. And that the point that what I pointed out is that Yitro accomplishes 2 different things. One is he makes it easier for Moshe. That is to say, he makes the system can now work. Moshe's idea can't work. That's point number 1. But point number 2 is he turns the justice system over to the people, or 98% over to the people, and they share in the implementation of justice. So as I pointed out, when we studied Yitro, I pointed out that that's a very important point. And then we get to the first verse of Mishpatim, V'ela Mishpatim asher tasim lifneihem. It takes on a different meaning, perhaps. It may be addressing the judges specifically, or maybe not. And even if it is addressing judges generally, but the judges are coming from the people. That was the whole point, that the people are going to be largely the judges. So this is an issue in general when we read these verses. To whom does the verse speak? So let me give you a good example of this. We open up to chapter 23. And let's begin with the first verse of chapter 23. Lo tisa shema shav. Lo tisa shema shav. Here, I'll use JPS's translation. You must not carry false rumors. Lo tisa shema shav. What does that mean? You shouldn't carry. The word tisa can mean to carry. But what does it mean? Who is being addressed over here? So within the rabbinic tradition, there are two very different readings of this verse. Lo tisa shema shav sounds like it's what we call mitzvah lo taseh, something we should not do. What is the prohibition? So one view is found in Chazal. Lo tisa shema shav means you shouldn't bear false rumors. Refers specifically to someone who is hearing what we would call lashon hara, someone says something bad about someone else. By the way, the bad thing could be false or it could be true. Lashon hara is not necessarily something which is false. False is something motzi shem ra, to say false things about people. But lashon hara could actually be true, but it's negative. And the point is, and there's no reason to say it. There are situations where you are permitted to, or even encouraged to say something about someone which is bad, if it's a pressing matter. You want to enter into a business agreement with somebody, and someone says to you, "Listen, you have to know that this guy's a total crook, and you should look at the record. You'll see for yourself. The last 5 guys who dealt with this guy lost a ton of money, and their reputation got ruined as well." That's not lashon hara. That's something which is necessary to do, permissible to do, etc. So lashon hara has its own set of rules. Generally speaking, it's fair to say that the rabbinic tradition is very, very negative when it comes to speaking bad about people. It's considered a very, very serious offense. Now, where's the prohibition not to speak lashon hara? Because in the system, we have to find it in the Torah. So it's not over here. The prohibition of the prohibition to speak what's called lashon hara is found in Parshat Kedoshim in chapter 19, what they call the Holiness Code, Kedoshim. Lo telech rachil bi'amecha. Lo telech rachil bi'amecha, in the beginning of chapter 19 of Vayikra, Parshat Kedoshim. Lo telech rachil. What does rachil mean? A rachil is a rochel is a merchant, somebody a traveling salesman, travels from one place to the next. So the word rochel is related to someone who walks around, and it's related to the word regel, actually, if you think about it, because what does l'ragel mean? L'ragel in Hebrew means to speak negatively about someone. It could also mean to spy, to find out negative things about the enemy. They are meraglim. So rechilut is related to regel, but it means to say bad things about people. Bad things, negative things, true things, false things, etc., etc. And lashon hara takes different forms. We're not getting into that now. One kind of lashon hara is I say to you, listen, so and so, Shimon, Shimon, he did X, Y, and Z. Whether he did or didn't, that's called lashon hara. Then there's another kind of lashon hara that's called rechilut, actually. The word rechilut, and that is where I say to you, Shimon, oh, I know Shimon very well. He says, well, Shimon, and I like him a lot. He's a good guy. And I say to you, well, that's very nice that you speak well of Shimon, but he doesn't speak well of you. That's called rechilut. It's saying to somebody what someone else is saying about them. So that's rechilut. This rechilut. So lashon hara generally takes different forms. The prohibition is lo terech rachil bi'amecha. You shouldn't speak lashon hara. But Chazal from this verse, lo tisa shem hashav, says something additional, which is it's not just forbidden to speak lashon hara. It's forbidden to hear it. Hamakablo. This they argue is the prohibition of actually hearing lashon hara. It's interesting that certain prohibitions, it's not just the one who does it, one might say, but others are included as well. I'll give you a parallel example, which is also something that Chazal came down very hard on. The Torah does, actually. And that is something that's very foreign to us, but loaning money at interest. It's called rebate or neshech. The Gemara says, the Torah says, it's forbidden to lend money with interest. And the prohibition, so someone who lends money, the lender is called the malva, and the one that borrows is the lova. The Gemara says the prohibition is not just the one that lends the money. The prohibition is also the one that actually receives the money. And not only that, the Gemara says in one place, not just the one that lends the money, and not just the one that receives the money, but if there are witnesses to this act, they also violate it. So they again have a situation where the rabbinic tradition, it sees the prohibition as encompassing much more. So lo tisa shem hashav, that is, according to one view in Chazal, the prohibition to hear lashon hara. Don't bear, don't carry with you false rumors. Someone wants to talk to you about so and so, I'm not interested, whatever. I don't want to hear it. That's one tradition within Chazal. Now there's another tradition about this verse. Lo tisa shem hashav is taken, it's found in the Gemara, that it's talking about a judge. Lo tisa shem hashav means, according to this interpretation, if you're a judge, don't hear one side of the case if the other party is not present. Prohibition for a dayan to hear testimony when only one of the two parties is in court. That's prohibited. Why? Perhaps because the presence of the other party would affect the way the person says the testimony. Perhaps because the judge forms the opinion immediately hearing the first argument, and only days later hears the other side. So that's a prohibition on the judge. That's a prohibition on the judge. And these verses, Kayla's scrolling down. I don't know why you're scrolling down, but you're scrolling down. We're still in verse number 1 here. But the point is, if you do scroll down, you will see that many of these verses seem to be related to a judge. For example, I'll give another example of where it's a question. Who is being addressed? And that is the first part of the second verse. Don't follow the majority to do wrong. We talked about that last week. I gave the example of Michael ben Yimor, the prophet, who was brought to Achav to hear what he wants to hear what the other king said. Let's see what a real prophet says. And as he's being brought to the king, they say to him, listen, all the other prophets are saying this. Why don't you make it unanimous? Make it unanimous. They're all saying this. Go with the crowd. So Michael, in the end, does not go with them. Very interesting story. But that's a case of an authority figure. That's not a judge, as it were, but a prophet. But we can understand the verses in general. Not talking about judges. You shouldn't just do just don't go with the flow. Just don't go with the majority just because they're the majority. Do what you think is right. Do what you know is right, as best you know. That's one way. But the Gemara has a different drasha, which Rashi quotes on this pasuk. Rashi says, it's not the pshat of the pasuk, but lo tiyach arayavim l'ra'ot, the Gemara says the following. The Gemara presumes, and I mentioned this last week, there is a basic principle in Jewish law, and I mean basic, to follow the majority. And it's a principle that is applied in many different areas. But one of them is the court. If there's a court of 3, and there's a case before the court of 3, you follow the majority. The Gemara says, Acharei, the last 3 words of this verse, Acharei Rabim Lahatot, follow the majority. I mentioned last week that does not seem to be the pshat of the pasuk at all. But in any event, that's the way Chazal understand it, or use the verse to make their point that you follow the majority. However, there are cases, says the Talmud, where you don't exactly follow the majority. And the case is the following. If there's a capital case, say a murder case, on murder cases, there are 23 judges. And let's say 12 judges say guilty and 11 judges say innocent. So normally you follow the majority. In a court of 3, if 2 say Reuven is guilty and 1 say Reuven is innocent, Reuven is guilty, because you follow the majority. But when it comes to capital cases, the Gemara says we don't follow a strict majority of 1. You need a majority at least of 2. So 12 to 11 doesn't work. It's got to be 13 to 10. So that's lo tiyah acharei rabim l'ra'ot. When it comes to ra'ot, in other words, the verse then is interpreted by that opinion to be referring specifically to a capital case. It doesn't sound that way from the verse. That's not our problem. But my point is here, once again, you can read the verse as referring to an individual, or you can read the verse as referring to a court. Let's have one other example of this. If you scroll down, okay, the next verse, once again, don't show deference to the poor man in a dispute. And if someone's wrong, they're wrong. Okay, then the next verses we already studied. Let's scroll down some more. Scroll down. Yeah, okay. This verse. Midvar sheket tirchak. V'noki v'tzadik al tarog ki lo atzdik rasha. Now, midvar sheker tirchak. They keep far away from falsehood. Avoid falsehood. Stick with the truth. So, who's that referring to? Can refer to anybody, right? Midvar sheker tirchak. Live the honest life. Deal with people who are honest. Whatever they say, you like, you don't like, but they're telling you the truth. Avoid dishonesty. First, anybody. But the Talmud has another interpretation, which is a very interesting interpretation. The Talmud says, in more than one place, it's in Masechet Shvuot, it's in Bava Kama, Mar says that, let's say you're a judge, and there's a case. Reuven and Shimon, there's a case. And Reuven makes his claim, very good claim. Not only does he make the claim, he has two witnesses to support him. Two witnesses, and the Talmud is the strongest proof you can have. Two witnesses confirm that the claim of Reuven is true. You're the judge. But here's the thing. You don't believe him. There's something about either Reuven or the witnesses, maybe something in their past. Now, everything is kosher. The claim is a valid claim. The witnesses are kosher witnesses. They give very clear testimony. But something doesn't feel right to you. What do you do in such a case? So in the Talmud, there are two different statements in the Talmud which seem to contradict. And this is a very interesting topic in its own right, a big topic. Not our topic. We're just studying the Chumash now. But in the Talmud, there are two different approaches to what you do. And the commentaries on the Talmud try to figure out how can we resolve these two different approaches. One approach is this. Let's say it's a monetary matter. So normally speaking, the Talmud says that even though the Torah says that when a case comes before the court, you have to look into it. You ask a lot of questions. That's the rule of the judges. All kinds of questions, time and place, and all kinds of other questions. The Talmud says that is true in all cases, but there was a rabbinic decree not to do that when it comes to monetary matters, like loans. The reason is that they were afraid if someone who lends money and then goes to court and wants to get the money back and has to be subjected to a million questions, people will stop lending money. And that's not good for the poor people. Poor people need to borrow money. In the Torah, by the way, and even in Chazal, I think, poor people borrow money. Not like nowadays. When you want to borrow money, you have to go to the bank and prove that you can pay them back. And you have money. If you have no money, you can't borrow money. Maybe you have to go to a loan shark, and then you get in other kinds of trouble. But in the Torah, only poor people borrow money. So the point is, so normally we don't ask a million questions, but when the case looks crooked, one view is in such a case, then the judges have to ask a million questions. Keep at it until they're convinced that it's okay. That's one view in the Talmud. The other view is that the judge drops out of the case. The judge says, I understand, I can't judge this case. Right? This situation is known in the Talmud and the commentaries as din meruma. A meruma, Ramai is a cheat or a dishonest person. When the case doesn't feel right to you, what do you do? There's a very, very famous dispute about, in terms of those that try to resolve this, by the way, what do you do in the din meruma? So according to one view, Rabbeinu Asher, the Rosh, he thinks that in monetary matters, that the judge can actually decide the case against the witnesses. If the judge is convinced that the other side is right, this guy has kosher witnesses and his claim seems perfectly valid, but the judge, something doesn't feel right, something's wrong, and Rabbeinu Asher gives the judge enormous latitude to make a decision against the witnesses. Most of the other commentaries don't accept that view. They talk about dropping out. It's interesting how do they resolve it. But this is basically, my point is, this din meruma is situation, according to this, midvar sheket tirchak, is not talking about a regular plain person. Midvar sheket tirchak refers to a judge. Once again, a verse right here, you can read it a general statement about staying away from falsehood, or you can read it as a statement specifically talking to the judges. Listen, the case doesn't look right, stay away. And what does stay away mean? Drop out is one view, or keep at it till you get the truth, etc., or decide against the witnesses even. That's, but my point is there are two ways to read the verse. Now we'll take one more verse, the next verse, V'shochad lo tikach. Do not take a bribe. Ki hashochad ya'aver pikim b'salef divrei tzadikim. Do not take bribes. Bribes blind the clear-sighted and upset the pleas of those who are right. The prohibition about taking bribes, which appears here, and some of these verses also appear in Sefer Dvarim, by the way. So there's a whole discussion about, first of all, what is a bribe? A bribe would be someone hands you, hands you money. You're judging the case. Here's $1,000 in cash. Before you judge the case, that's a bribe. But a bribe, generally understood, can be much broader than that. It doesn't have to be money. It could be someone that will do you a favor. It could be all kinds of things. Now, the point is that the verse, when you read it, clearly seems to be referring to someone who's judging a case. But one could, I think, interpret the verse as going beyond just the judge and talking in general. And it's certainly true that our decisions very often are made not on the basis of what is true or false directly, but on the basis of self-interest, or as I describe it, being vested in something. Because none of us are objective. I want to do X, but if I do X, what's going to happen to me, my family, my job, my reputation, all kinds of things. So there are all kinds of reasons that people don't do what they know to be right, because they stand to lose something. In a certain sense, that's also kind of shokha. And by the way, the interesting question, among other interesting questions, is this: what do you do in the following case? In other words, shochad lo tikach. Let's talk about the judge. Someone walks over to the judge and says, "Listen, here's some money to before you judge. I know you don't have that much money. Judges don't make much money. Here's some money for the case." So that's prohibited. You can't take the money because it will color your decision. Even if the guy says, "Listen, do what you think is right, but here's some money because I know you need the money," that's prohibited. What about a situation where both sides give him money? He's a judge, and both sides separately come and say, "Here's a few $100s for the judge," whatever the reason is. I know it takes a little time. They've taken up. I know it's spending a lot of time on the case. Here's some money. It's a very interesting question. I mean, judges typically get paid. Don't get paid by the people walking into court necessarily, but they are paid. What about if both sides pay you? What about if not one is paying you shochad, but both are paying you shochad? What about in such a case? So I saw a discussion about this, and I don't remember who says this, but one feeling is, it might have been in the chinuch. Don't remember the source, I'm sorry. But the argument is that in that case, it's also forbidden. Why is it forbidden? Because of another interesting principle or concept in Jewish law, and that is called pshara, or compromise. The Talmud, in the beginning of Tractate Sanhedrin, talks about pshara. Two people come to court. Reuven says to Shimon, "You owe me $1,000. Okay. What should the judge do? Should the judge say, "Okay, let's get the witnesses, let's hear the claims, are there claims, counterclaims, etc.?" That's one approach. The other approach is the judge says, "Look, I hear you're saying this, you say that. Why don't we make a compromise? Pay him $500, and we'll have a pshara." So the Talmud has three different opinions about that. Is that a good thing? Is it a permissible thing? Or is it a bad thing? It's a three-way dispute about a pshara. It's a good thing because that's how you make agreements. Every agreement, someone's got to give something, and the value peace is a value. Shalom is a value. You're going to get peace. And then, okay, maybe each one is unhappy, but that's fine. That's have a deal and move on. And one opinion says you can't do that because it's not true. Every pshara, or many psharot, are actually not true. The guy either loaned him 1,000 or didn't. He didn't loan him 500. So the point is, there's something about pshara which is untrue. So that's the question in the Talmud. In any event, so shochad actually, my point about shochad is, you can take it in the narrowest sense. One guy gives you a bribe. The Talmud discusses elsewhere, not in Sanhedrin, about what constitutes a bribe. And the Talmud is very strict. It has cases about people who someone did them a favor, even not intending to influence the case, and the judge opted out of the case. I can't judge the case anymore because psychologically or subconsciously, I might favor your side. That's the most interesting cases, not our topic, but the broader question. All these verses, are they referring to the individual or referring to the judge? That's a good question. I would add, by the way, I noticed last night that the next Vigero Tuchatz, do not oppress the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt, that the Ibn Ezra strikes me as not the best shot, but the Ibn Ezra says Vigero Tuchatz, do not oppress the stranger, says the Ibn Ezra, refers to the judge. Talking about a judge, when there's a case in front of your court, and there's a Jew, regular born Jew from birth, and a Jew who chose Judaism, a ger, says the Ibn Ezra, don't see them as equal in the court. Don't say one was a real Jew, the other guy's just a ger. No. They're exactly the same. The ger lo tuchatz, so he assumes that ger lo tuchatz refers to the judge. You know, we when we looked at the verse, we didn't assume anything of the sort. Maybe it refers also to the judge. That's possible. Okay, in any event, in general, this is certainly the case. But what I wanted to look at now, going back to one of my favorite books, which is Shmuel, and I wanted to show you a story in Sefer Shmuel that I believe that the author of the book of Shmuel had these verses in mind. But before we do that, to a rather interesting story, let me stop for a moment and see if there are any comments or questions.
There are no comments in chat, but I do welcome people in the Zoom room to ask. Debbie, I see you have a hand up, so go.
Thank you. Do we have any historical data on whether Gerim were discriminated against? Because it comes up so often. I mean, I can think of the story of Ruth, but aside from that, do we have any other stories? Because it's so often that you shouldn't be against a ger.
Right, it's verses 36 times. It's one of those things that actually, it really jumps out at you. I don't know about explicit discrimination. There's a very famous letter of the Rambam. So I forget the person, so-and-so Hager, a very famous letter of the Rambam, where where so-and-so said he can't do a particular thing. And the Rambam goes on and on about this. This is a terrible thing. And he goes on and on saying that, on the contrary, the ger is the highest level, and whoever this rabbi is talking this way to you is totally wrong. It's not our tradition, etc. You can find the Rambam's Igrot, a very, very famous one. So and so Hager, it's called, and it's look. It makes people in general. I don't have specific cases. I think there are statements in the Talmud which raise questions about. The questions that are raised often are about the authenticity of the person that's converting. There you have a lot of questions. What is the motive? In other words, it's a question. And it always is a question. What is the motive? And some people say, who cares what the motive is, basically? Whatever. I don't want to get into my own view about this. I maybe extreme view, but I feel that, someone wants to be Jewish, welcome aboard, the more the merrier. That's my view. But anyway, but there are certainly, I think, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, there's a sense that maybe they're not fully accepted. And the truth of the matter is, when you look at the halachot in general, there are certain spaces where the ger is not exactly equal to the born Jew. That is true within the system. It's also equally true, I think, that overall there's a real sense of responsibility to the ger. From the Torah, you see this. V'haftam et hager. If you, I think the Rambam says, if you misbehave towards the ger, you violate two things. You violate hafta recha kamocha. He is a Jew. And on top of that, you violate hafta et hager. So it's a double whammy. But not both are wrong. But then,
Well, it seems to me if the Torah says it so many times, clearly it was fighting against something that, a fear that the people wouldn't.
right, but it also goes back to Mitzrayim. The point of Mitzrayim is a place where the outsider is not accepted. Even Joseph is called the Ivri, the one from the other
Right.
side. He doesn't eat with them, etc., etc. So you have to remember, and I mentioned this, and we started these sessions about Mishpatim, that these are within the broader narrative. Maybe later today, if we have time, I'll get back to that point again about these rules, not floating in the air. They're in the book of Exodus.
Their
They're in the
reaction
book
to.
about reaction to, or responding to, or influenced by, or whatever, speaking to the experience of being slaves, which is why he started with Avdut. The first long set of rules is about slavery. So I think certainly that's human nature, and I think the Torah is saying you got to move away from that and learn from your experience in Mitzrayim, where you were on the receiving end, and don't impose upon other people that which you would not want imposed upon you. Okay, let's get down to the story that in the book of Shmuel, and the story is the following. Now again, we can't. All the background would take us a lot of time. The story is the following. It's one of the great sections of Sefer Shmuel, which has many great sections. But one of the story towards the second book is called Shmuel Bet. It's really one book, but what we call Shmuel Bet, one of the compelling stories is David and his son Avshalom. Avshalom, for whatever reason, not getting into that, is very angry at his father. It's related solely to the story of Amnon and Tamar, where he feels that David misbehaved, and he certainly did misbehave, in terms of his response to the rape of his daughter Tamar, who was molested by his son Amnon, his oldest son. David's very angry about it, but he does nothing. And Avshalom waits for David to do something. David does nothing. So Avshalom ends up killing Amnon. He takes his sister in to live with him, and he kills his brother. And Avshalom then runs away. And the book of Shmuel describes a situation afterwards where David never really fully brings Avshalom back. He keeps him at a distance. And at one point, finally, Avshalom rebels against his father. He has the support of most of Israel, it would appear. And he starts to march on Jerusalem, David's capital. And when Avshalom marches upon Jerusalem, strangely enough, King David says, we have to run away. He doesn't stand and fight. He says, we have to leave. That is found, I'll just read that to you, and then we'll get to the two parts of the book of Shmuel that I want to look at in the context of our study. But in chapter 15, David flees the city. David says, we have to run away, lest Avshalom kill us. And the servants say to David in verse number 15 of chapter 15, Shmuel Bet, whatever you want, we'll do. Whatever you want, we'll do usually means we don't like it, but we'll do it. Fine. And then I'll read you the verses. Vayetze hamelech b'chol beito b'raglav. Vayazov hamelech et eser noshim pilagshim l'shmor habayit. So David left with his household. B'raglav. B'raglav means following him. You have the verse right there. Following him. Fine. And then you have the next verse. Vayetze hamelech b'chol ha'am b'raglav. Vayamdu beit hamerchak. David and the king left, followed by the people who left B'raglav, following him. They stopped at the last house. Next verse. B'chol amadav vrima yodo kol hakreti v'chol hapleti kol hagitim sheish miot ish asher bo b'raglo migat ovrima pnei hamelech. So it describes who went with David. All the people were crossing over. His palace guard, Kreti and Pleti, probably the palace guard. The Gittites who had accompanied him from God. They all left B'raglo. Fine, that's all. And the next is interesting, but not our topic. Fine. So that David leaves, all these different people. And then Avshalom is marching upon Jerusalem. And the rest of chapter 15 and the beginning of chapter 16, it's one of the great chapters of the Bible, describe Avshalom is headed to Jerusalem, but the entire next chapter and a half is not about Avshalom. Avshalom comes to Jerusalem in the last verse of chapter 15. Before that, it describes what David goes through, whom David meets, who stays with David. David first gives up hope, and then he's resolved to try to make it back, etc. Fine. Now we get to chapter 16. Fine. So I wanted to look at is two stories in the book of Shmuel. They're related to each other. And I believe that the writer had our verses in mind. So David is walking up the mountain. He's left Jerusalem. He crosses the Kidron River. Kidron means the darkness, the river of darkness. And he goes to his whole mental state is described in a stunning way in chapter 15. And now David has come to the top. David Ovar Mi'at Meharos, chapter 16. V'nei tziva nam Mephibosheth l'kvato. V'tzemed chamorim chavushim. V'alayhem motayim lechem meyot zimukim u'meyot kayetz v'nevel yayin. V'yom ha'melech utziv el tziva mo'elulach. V'yom tziva ha'chamorim l'beit ha'melech l'kov. V'alechem v'akayetz l'echol. L'echol hanarim v'yayin l'shtot. Hayo'ef b'amidbar. Tziva, the servant of Mephibosheth, comes to greet David. And he comes with all kinds of provisions for David and David's army, right? What are all these things you bring me? The donkeys for your family to ride on, the figs for to eat, the wine to drunk. Those who are, because David is exhausted. David's running away. He is exhausted. His troops are famished. They're hungry. They're tired. They're on the run. Here comes Tziva with all of these provisions. Now, who is Tziva? Who is Tziva? So earlier in the book, chapter 9, we discover who Tziva is. David has taken over the kingship. Saul's family has been decimated. And Saul has a piece of property. Property belonged to King Saul. Tziva is described as the king's servant, the king's eved, who cares for the property. To chapter 9. Now remember that David has taken two different oaths in this book about what happens to the family of Saul, and not only the family of Saul, but the family of Jonathan, of Yonatan. Yonatan is the one who made David king, who saved David's life, who makes him king, and he tells David he has to run away, and he assists David. And he says to David, before David runs away, listen, I only have one request. Not just a request. I impose an oath upon you that whatever happens to me, you're going to take care of my family. Fine. That's the promise that David has made. David also swears later to Saul. Saul says the same thing to David, and a few chapters afterwards, and David swears to Saul. So David has taken an oath to care for the family of Saul and also the family of Jonathan, his friend. So with David in chapter 9 of this book, David asked the question, he's assumed the kingship. David says, is there anybody alive to the house of Saul? Chapter 9, is anybody still alive? I have to do chesed. I promise to do chesed to demonstrate my loyalty to Jonathan. And they say to him, there is one, Tziva. He goes to Tziva. And Tziva says he has one son. Maybe it's not Tziva that says it, but someone says to David, he has one son named Mephibosheth, who is lame, the Raglayim. In chapter 9. So David has to do chesed. So So David wants to do chesed. No, it's actually Tziva who says so. Tziva says there's one kid left who's lame. Fine. Then chapter 9 tells us how he became lame. He was running away during a battle. He was a child. He fell, whatever. So now the king calls Tziva in chapter 9. And Tziva is called Nar Shaul. And he says, listen, everything that belonged to Saul, the whole estate, belongs to Mephibosheth. And you work for Mephibosheth. You give him all the food, right? Give him the bread that he may eat. And then he says, but Mephibosheth doesn't actually eat with you. He's going to eat on my table. So he sets up the situation. Mephibosheth eats with David. And Mephibosheth, though, is being supported by Tsiva. Now, it turns out that Tsiva is not alone. Tsiva himself has 15 children and 20 slaves. He's a slave who has 20 slaves. Fine. Tsiva says, whatever you say, fine, whatever the king says, fine. Now, Mephibosheth was living by himself at that point, living in security. He's totally fine. But David has determined he made a vow, took an oath to help to take care of the family of Jonathan. The problem is there's virtually nobody left, it says. They're all dead. But it's Mephibosheth. So he's going to do all this kindness to Mephibosheth. That's chapter 9. What we study in the book of Shmuel, we spend a fair amount of time thinking about what kind of kindness is this. Is it actually a kindness or not? One thing that's certainly accomplished, you have this strange situation of 36 people working for one person to give him food, but the guy doesn't even eat there. He's eating on David's table. Anyway, but the field, formally speaking, now belongs to Mephibosheth. Right? But now we come to our story. David has fled Jerusalem. And David's troops, we are told earlier, are very tired and weary, etc. And all of a sudden, here comes Tsiva with all of these provisions. And he says, what is this? You have to help the king. This is for your provisions for your people, for you, for your people, etc., etc. Now let's get back to chapter 16, verse number 3. Vayomer HaMelech v'yayeh ben Adonecha. Where is the son of your Lord? That is Mephibosheth. He's actually Saul's grandson. Where is Mephibosheth? You're by yourself. Well, where is Mephibosheth? Vayomer Tsiva el HaMelech Hinei yoshev Yerushalayim ki omar hayom yoshivu li Beit Yisrael et mamlechut avi. He didn't want to come with me. He says, Israel today will restore the kingship to my father's house. He's waiting in Jerusalem because he imagines himself as being king. Fine. Vayomer HaMelech u'tziva hinei lecha kol asher leMephibosheth. Says the king to Tsiva, David, everything I gave Mephibosheth, that whole field, I gave it to him, it's now yours. Vayomer Tsiva hishtachaveti emtza chen b'einecha adoni hamelech. I bow down to you, O king. May I find favor in your eyes. Now, let's see if we can, as we say, unpack this for a moment. And there are two different points over here. So what is David doing? David accepts, one might say, David accepts the testimony of one person in the absence of the other. It's funny because David is, in one sense, he's the individual person. He's also a judge. The role of the king was to judge. So he's making a judgment based on what one person says. He hasn't heard the other side of the story. Let me ask you a question. What is the chance that this story is actually true? 0, right. I would say two things. First of all, how could he possibly imagine that this fellow, this lame fellow, lame means that, remember, the warriors in those days go out, they're not, they go out and they fight in the field, etc. What is the chance that this fellow could possibly be the king? Avshalom is coming with the support of most of Israel. Avshalom is like David. He's a warrior, rather ruthless one, I would add. Very powerful, charismatic warrior. What does that have to do with the house of Saul? The house of Saul is dead and buried. It's an internal fight between two different people in the tribe of Judah, King David and his son, who is, in a sense, next after Amnon's dead. He's the king in waiting in any event. What could possibly be the truth value of such a statement? But if it is true, and this guy is imagining that under these circumstances, he's going to become the king, what I would say is, never, the guy needs a lot of help. Deep therapy is required over here. If he's imagining such a crazy idea, which could never possibly happen, he has zero support. He was living by himself before David finds him and gives him this field, which he never asked for. It gives him the estate. Okay, if the guy is dreaming and imagining, I feel sorry for the guy. But what are the chances that he actually could do anything? The answer is zero. So from every standpoint, first of all, is it possible he's actually thinking this? Now remember, he's Jonathan's son. Jonathan represents, in the book of Shmuel, altruism. He's altruistic. He actually does something for the other guy with no benefit for himself. Jonathan gains nothing from making David the king. Jonathan is next in line. He makes David the king because he thinks that David will be a better king than Jonathan will. Jonathan's a great hero. Jonathan fights the Philistines, but he sees in David even a better fighter. And therefore he supports David with no benefit to himself whatsoever. Not only no benefit, but he suspects actually that bad things will happen. He actually suspects David. That's another conversation. In any event, here we have a perfect example of someone hearing the testimony of one side. It's like what the Gemara says. Well, Tisa Shem Masham. Don't hear this one side of the argument without hearing the other. And as I point out, here it's actually both. It's the individual, but it's also the judge, as it were. That's the story. Siva bows down. Siva is happy that now he has the entire field. He and his 20 sons and his 15 sons and his 20 slaves. It's another theme of Sefer Shmuel, which is this idea of the slave having slaves. It's another interesting feature of the book. Anyway, fine. That's part one of the story. Part one of the story. But now, after Avshalom is actually killed, Avshalom is dead. Avshalom has lost the war, and David is now the king. Let's leave out the death of Avshalom, David's mourning, and that's not our problem right now. And after David becomes the king, there's another description of who comes to greet him. Who comes to greet him? Not our problem in general. Amazing story, not our problem. But David crosses back into Jerusalem. And in chapter 19, verse number 25, we have, lo and behold, there's Mephibosheth. Chapter 19, verse 25. Before I get to this, I'm going to make another point. Why does David favor Ziba? What is David's favorite Ziba? David is not a naive person in this book, far from it. But he favors Ziba for one reason. Because Ziba comes with all these provisions. With all the animals and all the food for David and for his men and the food and the wine. And what does that verse remind us of? V'shochad lo tikach, right? Isn't that the next, right? Don't take a bribe. In other words, because the bribe will cause you to make a bad decision, right? Ya'aver pikrim, v'salef divrei tzadikim. The bribe will cause you not to see. The bribe you'll come in on the wrong side. In other words, does David actually believe this, or is David just doing it because he's bribed, or is it because of the bribe, because of all the provisions, he sees things a certain way? And the truth is, Mephibosheth, who has no power whatsoever, zero, he brings nothing to the table as far as David. Yes, there was a promise to Jonathan. There was an oath made in God's name on one side. On the other side, is the 200 animals, those are the two sides over here. So you have over here not just hearing the case of one without the other, which is clear, right? And it's probably sheker on top of it. That doesn't sound reasonable. And if it is, this is saying such a thing, nebuch, it makes no sense. But there's another element over here about the food. There's a benefit to Ziba. Ziba is a powerful man. It's the powerful slave serving the weak master. That's the point. Kind of thing that the book of Shmuel loves, by the way. In any event, so now we have the following. The king is crossing back. And there is Ziba coming to greet him. Chapter 25. I'm not seeing it. Chapter 25, chapter 19, verse 25. Umefiboshet ben Shaul, Yorav Likrat Hamelech. He Mephibosheth comes to greet David, Saul's grandson, comes to meet David. Interesting. He had not painted his toenails or trimmed his mustache or washed his clothes from the day the king had left until the day he returned safe. What is being described in this verse about Mephibosheth? In a word, what kind of behavior does this remind us of?
Mourning.
He's in mourning, exactly. Ever since King David left, and Avshalom is coming, Mephibosheth is in mourning. Does not sound like a guy who's thinking, I'm going to become the king. He's in mourning. And by the way, it's a very important point, because being in mourning is not what he says. In other words, the point is, the idea that he's dreaming of kingship hardly would work with the soul is actually behaving as one would who's in mourning. So before we know what he says or anything, we right away think, probably it's Jonathan's son, but apart from all that, the guy's in mourning. Vayiki ba Yerushalayim with Krat HaMelech, he goes out to greet the king. Vayom lo HaMelech, Lom lo halachti mi Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth, why didn't you go with me? By the way, let me just make a separate point. I'm not sure I discussed it in this context. I discussed it in a different context more than once in the last month or two, about the book of Ruth. That in that chapter where Tsiba, just before Tsiba comes to meet David in chapter 16, in chapter 15, Itai Hagiti, the Gitites traveled with David. If you remember, David turns to Itai Hagiti, who's one of David's generals, actually. And he says to Itai the Giti, go back to Jerusalem, go back to King Avshalom. Why should you go with me? I don't know where the heck I'm going. And you're already a Ger, you're already a stranger, you're from Gat, you're from the land of the Philistines. Take care of yourself and your family. And Itai the Giti says to David, wherever my king goes, I will go, in life and death. The book of Ruth actually had that verse in front of them when they wrote the book of Ruth. David says to Itai the Gittite, don't go with me. And David has a benefit from Itai the Gittite. Itai the Gittite is a powerful man. Says David, do what's best for yourself. Mephibosheth brings nothing to the table. He can barely walk. He can't move around. He's just a burden. You'll be a burden. What is the point? David doesn't need him. Mephibosheth, why didn't you go with me, says David. What does Mephibosheth say? Vayomer Adoni HaMelech Avdi Rimali. There's something very important over here. For this next point, it's worthwhile coming to all these sessions, just for this next point. I'll tell you what it is in a minute. Vayomer Adoni HaMelech, my Lord King, Avdi Rimali, my servant tricked me. Ki Omer Avdecha, Ech B'Shaliach Hamor V'Yarkav Aleh, Ve'Lecha HaMelech, Ki Piseach Avdecha, V'Yiragel B'Avdecha El Adoni HaMelech. V'Adoni HaMelech K'malach Elohim, Aseh Atov B'Yeinecha. My Lord King, my servant deceived me. I said to him, saddle up the donkeys so I can go to the king, because as you know, I can't walk. I'm lame. Right. Vayiragel, but my servant Siba, Vayiragel B'Avdecha. Vayiragel is a play on the word Vayiragel. L'ragel is to speak slander, right? Or Telech Rachil B'Yamecha. He slandered me. He said to the king, whatever he said to you, he wants to become the king himself. But if Vayiragel has a second point, he forced me to go by foot, which I can't walk.
Right.
Vayiragel B'Avdecha. Now I'll ask you the question: is he telling the truth or not telling the truth? Is Mephibosheth telling the truth or not? He's obviously telling the truth, but there's another point over here. We now understand something that we didn't understand earlier. Very important point about reading these texts. We now understand why when David leaves Jerusalem in chapter 15, that 3 consecutive verses, it talks about all the people that left Biraglav.
Veraglav.
At the time we noticed it said 3 times Biraglav. We had no idea why the text uses that word until chapter 19. Suddenly, 4 chapters later, looking back, oh, now I understand the Biraglav. This is a very, very important point, that sometimes the text is saying something, but you can't know what it is at the time. But you notice it. You file it away for further reference. And 4 chapters later, we understand how the text plays with Biraglav. Yes, they left Baraglov. Why Baraglov? Because this guy can't go Baraglov. That's what. And my servant, I said, saddle up the donkeys. Vayiragel b'yavdecha. He spoke slander to me, but vayiragel to play on regel. And then Mephibosheth says, but you know what? Do whatever you want. I know, he says, ki lo haya kol beit avi ki yem anshe mavet ladoni hamelech v'atoshet et avdecha b'yochei shulchanecha u'mayesh li od tzedakah v'lezod od hamelech. He says, listen, do what you think is right. I know that my family had wars against you, and therefore you don't owe me anything. I'm not asking for anything. You do what you think is right. If you think I'm treasonous, you do whatever you want to do. But of course, we know what Mephibosheth says is also true. He didn't say something else. He could have said, listen, mister. Without my father, you're a zero. Don't forget that. David seems to have forgotten that. Doesn't say that. He says, do whatever you want, he says. Now we have the next verse. Very sad verse. Vayomelo hamelech. Lo mitadeber od dvarecha. Amarti. Atov etziva tach l'kuat hasadeh. Says the king to Mephibosheth, don't stop talking so much. Don't have to talk anymore. I made a decision. You and Siva will divide the field. Vayom Mephibosheth el hamelech gam et hakol yikach. You can have the whole field. Acharei asher ba adoni hamelech b'shalom el beito. I'm happy that my Lord King has come back in peace to his house. You know, the book of Shmuel has all kinds of critiques. Some people try to say for every kasha. They always want to resolve, to explain this, to explain that. The author of the book has zero interest in that, obviously. And there are all different kinds of critiques. But here we have maybe the worst critique of all. It's a terrible critique of David over here, terrible. Because the point is, what is the point actually? What do you think? What is the point of these verses? What is the critique over here? It's very, very sad.
David, I think it's Sandra. It echoes to me not only the abuse of a lame person who's clearly telling the truth, and King David's job is to discern truth from falsehood. It reminds me, it echoes a little bit about the problem with the parable of Natan the prophet. David basically took the one lamb that Uriah had, but he didn't see it when it was he who was living the perfidy. He only saw the injustice when Natan put it in parable form. So here he is doing the same thing. He's basically abusing the unfortunate, the lame, especially against a vow that he made, basically a blood vow.
That is true.
So basically, I see it as two sides of the same coin.
That may be. I'm not disagreeing, but there's something else.
He was told, the Torah says not to divide in judgment.
No, that's all true. No, this is another point over here. This point, actually, Fackelman noticed this point, John Fackelman, and it's very true. And the point is this. What the devastating critique is, King says, what are you talking so much for? I said, you can divide the field. In other words, from David's standpoint, he said, why is this guy coming to me? What does he want? Obviously, he wants to get the field. He probably seems to know that I slandered him and that he's going to take away the field. So he's going to do what I call he's going to do a compromise, a pshara, right? The guy says, you owe me $1,000. The guy says, nothing, okay, pay him 500. He's going to do a pshara. But the point is, the critique is something else. The critique is, this guy can't even understand. In other words, the point is, he can't understand somebody who actually does something not for their own gain. The reason Mephibosheth comes to greet David has nothing to do with the field. First of all, he never wanted the field in the first place. He was living elsewhere. That's all David's sense of, I have to fulfill my promise, which of course he can't actually fulfill the promise. It's too late because they're all dead. So he wants to, but the critique is, this guy can't even understand why Mephibosheth is coming. Because he judges the other guy, he's thinking about himself. If I were doing it, I would want the field. Says, okay, you can have half the field. Says Mephibosheth, field? I'm not interested in the field. I'm happy at home, that's all. That's the critique. The critique is this guy can't even imagine such a thing. That's the power of this thing over here. Of course, it's about abuse. Of course, it's about, as I said before, the question: can you take shochet from both parties? And the position you can't do that because you make a compromise to satisfy each one. But maybe there is no compromise in this case. Maybe it's clear. Maybe it belongs to one and not the other. Maybe one is right and one is wrong. But the point over here is exactly this point. But beyond all that, this guy can't even imagine someone behaving this way. And what's crazy is that Mephibosheth is not the only person. Jonathan also was pretty much in the same ballpark because Jonathan made him king. Without Jonathan, David's not the king. Saul's going to kill him. Jonathan saves his life. Jonathan goes out to the field and tells him to run away, etc., etc., etc. Jonathan just said, listen, someday you'll be the king. And the subtext is, and I know what happens when you become king. Right now, you're standing in front of me and you're bowing down and crying and you're risking your life in doing it. That's all true. But go in peace and don't forget the promise. Because when you become king, kings forget all the promises. That's the point. This guy can't even imagine someone behaving this way. That's the critique over here. What kind of person is he? What is that? What does he become? Terrible, terrible business. Anyway, but here's the point. He's managed in these little stories to violate every single thing that we've studied. Everything. He accepts the testimony of one without the other. He listens to a false rumor. It's obviously false. He does it because the other guy provides material benefit to him, etc., etc. At the end of the day, he makes a compromise. What kind of compromise? Compromise is between the person who can help me, got it with money, and the other guy who speaks the truth. That's the so-called compromise. That's the pshara over here. Is this a pshara? Of course not. Anyway, I thought the story it's a great story in its own right, but it actually picks up on all of these verses. Okay, let me now finish up. Let me finish here with the let's conclude with something about this section in general. That is to say, mishpatim. So we started with, of course, there are many, many laws over here. We just touched on a few, but I didn't think we could just ignore them and move on. So we spent a few weeks on these rules. And as I pointed out, it starts with the rules about slavery. The longest section is about slavery. And we discussed how it also mentions the Gerut and Avdut and Inui, which is the covenantal formula. And it concludes, chapter 23 concludes, the very end, not the very end of chapter 23, but the last set of laws talk about the following, beginning in verse number 10 of chapter 23. Chapter 23, verse number 10. Take a few minutes. V'shei shonim tizrat atzecha, v'yosafta et tvuata, v'yashvi'i tishmetena untashta, v'yachu evyonei amecha, v'yitram tochal chayat hasodeh, kein ta'aseh l'karmecha l'zeitecha, sheshet yomim ta'aseh ma'asecha, uv'yom hashvi'i tishbot, l'man yonuach shocha v'chamorecha, v'yinafesh ben amotcha v'hager. But after we finish with the section about, remember that, be kind, don't oppress the stranger, you were strangers to the land of Egypt, we have verse number 10 and verse number 11 and verse number 12. And what is the subject of verses 10, 11, and 12? The subject of verse 10, 11, and 12 is, first of all, verse 10 and verse 11 refer to what we call Shemitah, not working in the seventh year. You work the field for 6 years, but in the seventh year, Hashvi'it, Tishmetena unitashta. Tishmetena unitashta. So what does Tishmetena unitashta mean? It's pretty much mean the same thing, abandon the field, leave the field. So the Ramban says Tishmetena unitashta means don't work the field in the seventh year. That's number one. And number two, nitashta. You abandon the field, you leave it for others. Other people can come into your field, people, animals, and they can eat the produce of your field. In other words, the purpose of the Shemitah, says the Torah, is it's a way to provide food for the poor people and also for the animals. You should do this for your field, for your vineyard, and for your olive groves. So this is the response, the chiyuv of, it's called Shemitah. What is Shemitah in the Torah? Later on, the Torah has a whole section about Shemitah, the end of Vayikra, a whole section. And it's about Shabbat. Shemitah is called Shabbat. The seventh year is the Shabbat. That's verses 10 and 11. And verse number 12 is actually Shabbat itself. Sheshet Yomim Tasem Ma'asecha, work for 6 days. Uvayom HaShivayi Tishbot, on the seventh day you rest. Why do you rest on the seventh day? L'man Yanuach Sharcha B'chamorecha V'Yinofesh Ben Amotcha V'Ager. It's not only for you to rest on the seventh day, but it's for everybody in your household to rest, including the animals, not just the people, not just the servants, not just the stranger that's with you, but also the animals. It parallels verse number 11, which talks about leaving the field open to others on the seventh year, not just the people, but also for the animals, right? Yitrom tochal chayat hasadeh in verse number 11. And what's interesting over here is, this is the end of the section. The beginning of the section starts with the slavery, the slaves, with avodim. But the end of the section goes back, and avodim are not just the story of the book of Exodus, but also the first of the 10 commandments. I am the God who took you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You're now my servants. You're not Avdei Paro, not Avdei Mitzrayim. And then we have the laws of the servant, of the slave, in the beginning of Mishpatim. And the longest of the 10 commandments, once you get past have no God before me, is the Shabbat, of course. But in the 10 commandments of in chapter 20, when it talks about Shabbat, it talks about, remember that Sabbath is a day of rest. Remember that I created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. So Chorat Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho, right? Just as I rested on the seventh day, you should rest on the seventh day as well. But over here, what's interesting is the end of Mishpatim, there's suddenly a completely different way to understand the Shabbat, which is that fundamentally the Shabbat is a day of rest, not only for you, maybe not even primarily for you, but for everybody in your purview, everybody around you. It's a day to give the others a day of rest. If one could say, the same way in the beginning of this section, it talked about 6 years of slavery, and the seventh year you go free. At the end of the section, it's 6 days of work. On the seventh day, you are free from labor, you and everybody about you. It's very interesting that in the book of Devarim, in the 10 commandments in Sefer Devarim, when it talks about Shabbat, it talks about, remember you were slaves in the land of Egypt. It doesn't say it earlier in Shmo, it just mentions creation. But over here you have actually, in these verses over here, you have, it starts actually with Shemitah. Starts with the seventh year, not working the field in the seventh year, and then you move to Shabbat. As I mentioned, later in the Chumash, Shemitah is called Shabbat. And I would also add something else, which is interesting in terms of the rabbinic tradition. What the rabbinic tradition, the Ramban makes this point. The Torah in the end of Vayikra, we're all familiar with it. In chapter 25, there's a whole long section about Shemitah, and then about Yovel, the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year. And it begins by saying, God spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai. And it starts with Shemitah. And the commentaries are all interested in asking the question, why does it mention Mount Sinai specifically when it comes to the Shemitah? And the point of the Ramban, what the Ramban says is the following. Ramban says that Shemitah is actually mentioned earlier. It's mentioned in chapter 23, verses number 10 and verses number 11. It mentions it, 2 verses. But then the Torah goes back to the Shemitah. At the end of the book of Vayikra, the Torah goes back to the Shemitah and says, the same way the Ramban explains, Shemitah was mentioned briefly earlier, but there's so much more to it. It's so much more to it. So Shemitah is an example of a mitzvah that was given earlier in the Torah, but it has so much more to it. There's so many other elements to it. And Shemitah then becomes the Ramban kind of paradigm for all the mitzvot. The idea of a Torah Shebaal Peh, the idea that you have 1 or 2 verses, but there's a whole world around it, a world of rules, a world of concepts, of ideas, etc. Shemitah becomes, basically, what is Shemitah? Shemitah Shabbat. Shabbat becomes, in a way, the central mitzvah. The covenant, which is reaffirmed at the end of Vayikra, focuses primarily upon Shemitah, which is the Shabbat of the land. And I just wanted to conclude by pointing out that the conclusion over here, which talks about first Shabbat of the land, and then Shabbat, and then the festivals, beginning with Pesach, it takes us back to the heart of the book. This law code in Mishpatim, which is very incomplete. We've spoken about that many times. It's very incomplete, but it's touching upon the basic ideas of the book of Exodus. The basic idea of the book of Exodus is freedom from slavery. And the basic mitzvah of the book of Exodus, if you pick out one mitzvah that is central in this book, it's got to be Shabbat. Because Moshe went to Paro and said, we have to go and serve God and bring sacrifices. And Pharaoh said to Moshe in chapter 5, Lama Moshe v'Aaron tashibitu et am. Why would you give them a Shabbos? When you work for Pharaoh, there's no Shabbos. He doesn't like Shabbos. Shabbos gives you a time to think, what am I doing? To evaluate, he doesn't want that. And then Shabbat appeared again with the man in chapter 16. You can collect the food, but on Shabbat you don't collect. And then Shabbat appeared in the instructions to build the Mishkan in chapter 31. And then Shabbat will appear again in chapter 35 before they actually build the Mishkan. And Shabbat appears in the Ten Commandments. And Shabbat appears in chapter 23. That is the idea of slavery and freedom from slavery, the idea of work, which is so central. Shabbat is a central, is connected to it in the deepest way. And here you see it explicitly. Work for 6 days. On the seventh day, nobody works. Not you, not your animals, not the ger, not the slave, nobody. It's a day of rest for everyone. So apart from the fact that it's recalling the creation, apart from that, it's a day of rest. It speaks to what's at the core of the book. And of course, at the end, we have the three festivals, beginning with Chag HaMatzot Tishmar. It takes us back to Pesach again, the holiday that marks our freedom. So the point is, the larger point I wanted to make over here in a relatively brief discussion of these mitzvot is that they're not in a vacuum. These are mitzvot which speak to what is central to the book. And what is central to the book is freedom from slavery of Pharaoh. What does it mean to be God's servant? That's one of maybe the core theme of the book. That's how the book will end, with the Mishkan. So I just wanted to add, so I added these three sessions. When we resume next time, I think we should just complete the book of Exodus, which means looking at the Mishkan and the golden calf story. And then we'll decide which way to go after we finish the book of Exodus. My thinking right now is actually a book that I taught maybe once in my life. I'm very interested in the book, and that is Sefer Devarim. Because Sefer Devarim, when you look at it, and objectively speaking, it's completely different than everything else we have. It's totally different than the rest of the Torah. Not only is it different, it seems to contradict it at every turn. And what is that about? So there's something extremely interesting about Sefer Devarim, but we'll pick up, we still have to complete the Sefer Shemot, and the next set of sessions, whatever that will be, I'd like to finish up Sefer Shemot. And thank you all for participating. Okay, I think there's a lot to think about over here.
Thank
All
you.
right. All right. Just time for, do you have a
Thank
moment for
you.
one or two more questions?
Yeah, sure.
So this is from Yehudi. Sorry, I didn't catch your comment, Yehudi, earlier. She mentioned that David is talking past Mephibosheth and he has lost being on the same wavelength.
Oh, he's certainly not on the same wavelength, that's for sure. But my point is that of course, I mean, he's thinking, when we study the book of Shmuel, I make the following statement, which I think is generally true. When David is out, when David is out of power, when David is running away, David, Ittai the Gittite, David's leaving. David says, I don't know where I'm going. You know what? You do what's best for yourself. You have people to take care of. Go back to King Avshalom. Safe for you to go back there. Threat to him. Don't come with me. When David is out of power, he is stellar, actually. The issue in the book is when David is returning to the power, because what the book is about, Sefer Shmuel, is about. It's a warning, actually. It's a critique of kingship. I'm not saying the book's against kingship. What the book is saying is when you have people in power, there's always the danger, because the objective becomes to stay in power. And if that's your objective, to stay in power, that overrides everything else. And you end up with all kinds of bad decisions being made. And the worst of it in the book is you lose the ability to see. To see. I talked about shochat earlier, about bribes. There are all kinds of bribes. The people who are people that are vested in something, it's very hard for them to see the truth because they're vested. The person who sees most clearly in the book of Samuel is Hannah. She's a woman without children, whose husband gives up on her hopes, who's surrounded by people who have no understanding of her at all. She sees the most clearly. She sees perfectly well. And that's part of the challenge in the book is if you have the power, can you be in a place where you still are able to see? And one of the solutions, partial solution to the problem is you should have a prophet in your court, because the prophet sees. But there is always that challenge. If Mephibosheth, he is a lame guy. He has nothing basically. He's a remnant. He's a remnant of a failed kingship. He sees perfectly well. He's perfect. He appreciates David for what David is. He believes in the kingship of David, but it's the kingship of David and there's the person of David. And the person of David, often in these stories, is extremely problematic. And one of the real low points for David is that conversation with Mephibosheth. Stop talking so much. You have half the field. Field? What field? That is it.
But,
And everyone's in place.
but just as tragic is Avshalom, who's very fit, and that kind of loss of a child churning against you is the ultimate failure.
Avshalom is a tragedy, but the tragedy is, question is, when we're studying the book of Shmuel, whose fault is Avshalom? And the answer is it's Avshalom's fault, but it's also David's fault. Because David is largely responsible. David understands that. Now, what Avshalom becomes or doesn't become, which is the king. From David's standpoint, the only one he wants the king is Avshalom. He has no interest in anybody else. Not Shlomo, not Adonijah, nobody. The man who would have been king, should have been king, is dead. And for David, that's the end of it. He has no interest in the others. He gets convinced finally to take Shlomo, but he has no interest in Shlomo, obviously. Anyway, that's another story. The book of Shmuel, we can go back to 100 times. I'm going to stop at this point. Thank you all. Looking forward to learning together.
Thank you. Have a great
Thank
summer.
you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Understood.
everyone. While this class is ending and we'll be on pause for the rest of the summer, there is still more learning at Drisha. Mishnah in Depth will return to live on July 6th at 1 p.m. with Horiot. You are welcome to sign up for this and other summer offerings at drisha.org/classes. I hope to see as many of you as possible when Rabbi Silber's Tanakh class resumes in, say, Elul.
Thank you.
Take care.